The wind tore through the trees like a blade, and Elena Whitmore could no longer feel her fingers. Snow fell so thick that the road had vanished beneath her feet, and the lantern she carried flickered weaker with every step. She had left the village 3 hours ago to deliver a finished coat to Ashford Manor, a task her mother was too sick to complete herself. Now the storm had swallowed the path home, and the manor's iron gates were the only shelter for miles. She pounded on the servant's door until her knuckles ached. No one answered. The staff had already retired, and the wind swallowed the sound of her fists against the wood. Desperate, she tried the side entrance near the kitchen garden, and to her surprise, it gave way. She stumbled into a dark corridor, shivering so hard her teeth clattered together. She did not mean to go far. She only wanted a moment to warm herself before finding a servant to help her. But the corridor led to a grand hallway, and the grand hallway led to a room with a fire still glowing in its hearth. She crept toward the warmth like a moth drawn to flame, unaware that this was the private study of the master of the house. The chair beside the fire was deep and soft, draped in dark velvet. She told herself she would sit only for a minute, only until her body stopped trembling. But exhaustion had been building in her for days, sleepless nights spent nursing her mother and stitching by candlelight to pay for medicine. The warmth of the fire wrapped around her like a blanket she had not felt in months. Her eyes grew heavy. She fought it, blinked hard, told herself to rise. But the chair was too soft, the fire too gentle, and within minutes, she was asleep. She did not know how long she slept. She did not know that the master of Ashford Manor, Duke Julian Ashford, had returned from a late ride through the storm to check on a fence line damaged by the wind. She did not know that he walked into his study expecting solitude, the only place in his cold house where he allowed himself to lower his guard. He froze in the doorway. A stranger sat in his chair. A young woman, her cloak still dusted with melting snow, her dark hair falling loose across her shoulders, her breathing slow and even. For a moment, Julian felt something he had not felt in years, surprise sharp enough to still his footsteps. His first instinct was anger. No one entered his study uninvited. No one touched his chair, his fire, his silence. He opened his mouth to demand she wake and explain herself, but the words did not come. Instead, he found himself studying her face, the way the firelight softened the exhaustion carved into her features, the way her hands, though red from cold, still held the shape of someone who worked hard and asked for nothing. He should have called for Margaret, the housekeeper, immediately. He should have had the girl removed and questioned. Instead, he stood there far longer than he intended, caught in a stillness he could not explain even to himself. Finally, he stepped forward and touched her shoulder, careful, though his voice when it came was sharp. "Wake up." Elena's eyes flew open. For one confused second, she thought she was still dreaming, still safe in her own small bed. Then she saw him, a tall man with dark eyes and a face carved from stone, standing over her in a room far too fine to belong to her. She scrambled up from the chair so fast she nearly fell. "I am so sorry, my lord. I did not mean the storm. I only wanted to warm myself. I swear I meant no harm." "You are in my study," Julian said, his voice cold enough to match the storm outside. "In my chair. How did you enter my house?" "The side door was open. I knocked at the servants' entrance first, truly I did, but no one came, and the storm was so fierce, I feared I would not survive the walk home." He studied her, searching for a lie in her wide, frightened eyes, and found none. Only exhaustion, and a fear that seemed to run deeper than simply being caught in a nobleman's study. He recognized that particular fear. It was the fear of someone who had learned that mistakes, even small ones, could cost her everything. "What is your name?" "Elena, my lord." "Elena Whitmore. My mother is a seamstress in the village. I was bringing a mended coat to your housekeeper when the storm caught me." Julian said nothing for a long moment. Ordinarily, he would have sent for the constable, or at the very least, dismissed the girl into the night without a second thought. He had done so before, with far less reason, but something about the way she stood, trembling but proud, refusing to grovel even in her fear, held him still. "The roads are impassable," he said finally, though it pained him to admit it. "You cannot walk home in this." Elena's eyes widened further. "My lord, I would not dream of imposing." "You already have," he said, though there was less bite in it now than before. "Margaret will find you a place to sleep until the storm clears. In the morning, you will leave, and this will be forgotten." He turned from her before she could answer, striding to the bell pull to summon the housekeeper, and Elena stood frozen in the center of the grand study, unsure whether she had just been rescued or condemned. Margaret Hale arrived within minutes, wrapped in a shawl, her gray hair braided for the night. She took one look at Elena's soaked cloak and pale face and clicked her tongue with motherly disapproval, though whether it was aimed at the storm or at her master's chair, Elena could not tell. "Come along, dear, let's get you warm and fed before you catch your death." As Margaret led her from the room, Elena glanced back once. The Duke stood by the fire, his back to her, his shoulders rigid as though carved from the same stone as his face. She did not understand why her heart beat faster at the sight of him, or why she felt, for one strange moment, that she had disturbed something far older and colder than his study. Margaret settled her in a small but warm room near the kitchens, brought her a bowl of hot broth and a blanket, and fussed over her until Elena's shivering finally stopped. As she ate, Margaret sat across from her, studying her with sharp, curious eyes. "You gave the master quite a fright, sitting in his chair like that," Margaret said. "He does not like surprises." "I did not mean to trespass," Elena said quietly. "I only wanted to warm myself for a moment." "I believe you," Margaret said, and there was something gentle in her voice that Elena had not expected from the household of a man so famously cold. "But I will tell you this. In 10 years of service, I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you tonight." Elena did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She finished her broth in silence, and when Margaret finally left her to rest, she lay awake far longer than her exhausted body should have allowed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment the Duke's cold eyes had met hers. She did not know that in the study above, Julian Ashford sat by the dying fire long after she had gone, staring at the empty chair where she had slept, feeling something shift inside him that he had spent 5 long years making sure would never shift again. He told himself it was nothing. A stranger had trespassed in his home, and he had been startled, that was all. By morning, she would be gone, and his house would return to the silence he had built so carefully around himself, brick by brick, since the day his heart had been broken beyond what he believed repair. But even as he told himself this, some quiet part of him, long buried beneath duty and grief, wondered if the storm outside was not the only thing that had changed course that night. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the road that led away from Ashford Manor deeper with every passing hour. And though neither of them could have known it yet, that storm was only the beginning. By morning, nothing about Ashford Manor would look the same, and nothing about its master would ever be quite as cold again. Elena woke to gray light filtering through unfamiliar curtains, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the events of the night before rushed back to her, the storm, the study, the stranger's chair, the Duke's cold eyes finding her asleep in his private sanctuary. Her face flushed hot with embarrassment even as her body remained chilled from the long walk through the snow. She sat up quickly and looked toward the window. What she saw made her stomach drop. The snow had not stopped. If anything, it had grown worse overnight, piling in drifts taller than a grown man against the garden wall. The road she had walked the evening before was gone entirely, buried beneath a white blanket that showed no sign of clearing. A soft knock came at the door, and Margaret entered carrying a tray of tea and bread. "You're awake, good. I was beginning to think that broth put you into too deep a sleep." Margaret set the tray down and glanced toward the window with a knowing look. "I imagine you've seen the roads." "I have to get home," Elena said, rising too quickly and swaying with the effort. "My mother is ill. She needs me." "And you'll be no use to her frozen in a snowbank," Margaret said firmly, though not unkindly. "No one is traveling anywhere today, dear. Not even the Duke's own carriage could make it past the front gate. You'll stay until the storm breaks, and that is the end of it." Elena wanted to argue, but the ache in her legs and the memory of how close she had come to real danger the night before silenced her protests. She sank back onto the edge of the bed and nodded, though worry for her mother sat heavy in her chest. "Is there any way to send word to the village? To tell my mother I am safe?" Margaret's expression softened. "I'll see what can be arranged once the wind dies down. For now, eat something. You'll need your strength." After Margaret left, Elena dressed in her own clothes, now dry but still smelling faintly of wood smoke from the study fire, and ventured cautiously into the halls of Ashford Manor. She had never seen anything like it. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every step. The ceiling soared so high that her footsteps echoed strangely, and every surface gleamed with a wealth she had only imagined in stories. She found her way, more by accident than intention, to a small library near the east wing, its shelves lined floor to ceiling with books. She had always loved to read, though such luxury was rare in her small cottage, and she could not resist running her fingers along the spines, marveling at titles she had never heard of. "You read?" The voice startled her so badly, she nearly knocked a book from the shelf. She turned to find Julian standing in the doorway, dressed now in a dark coat, his expression as unreadable as it had been the night before. "I do, my lord, when I have the time, which is rarely. Most young women of your station cannot." Elena felt a flare of quiet indignation beneath her nerves. "My mother taught me herself. She believes knowledge should not belong only to the wealthy." Something flickered across Julian's face, there and gone so quickly she nearly missed it. Perhaps surprise, perhaps something closer to respect. "An admirable philosophy," he said finally, though rare in practice. He crossed the room, and Elena stepped back instinctively, though he made no move to threaten her. He simply reached past her to the shelf and pulled down a slim volume of poetry, studying its cover as though seeing it for the first time in years. "My mother used to read this to me," he said, so quietly Elena almost did not hear it. "Before she decided the world required me to be someone else." Elena did not know what to say to such an admission, spoken so unexpectedly from a man whose reputation painted him as unfeeling stone. She watched him carefully, sensing that whatever door had cracked open in that moment was fragile, and that the wrong word might slam it shut again. "You could read it again," she offered softly. "Just because the world requires certain things of us, does not mean we must give up everything we love." Julian's eyes met hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, charged with something neither could name. Then, as though catching himself doing something forbidden, Julian set the book down abruptly and stepped back. "You should return to the kitchens before Margaret worries," he said, his voice cooling again, the walls rebuilding themselves brick by brick. "The library is not meant for guests." "Of course, my lord." Elena dipped a small curtsy, confused by the sudden shift, and hurried from the room. But as she walked away, she could not stop thinking of the brief moment when his voice had softened, when the cold Duke of Ashford Manor had, for just a heartbeat, sounded almost human. Julian remained in the library long after she left, the book of poetry still in his hand. He told himself he had only spoken from tiredness, from the strange disruption of the storm to his usual solitude. He told himself many things that morning, none of which explained why he found himself, an hour later, quietly asking Margaret whether the young woman had eaten enough, whether she was warm enough, whether she required anything at all. Margaret, no fool after decades in his service, said nothing of the questions to anyone, but she watched her master with new interest, noting the way his eyes drifted toward the corridor whenever footsteps passed, the way his usual sharp impatience softened whenever Elena's name came up in conversation. By midday, the storm had not lessened, and the household settled into the strange rhythm of waiting it out. Elena helped where she could, unwilling to sit idle as a guest in a house so grand it made her uneasy. She assisted the kitchen staff, mended a torn curtain in the drawing room, and found small tasks to occupy her worried mind, all while trying not to think too much about the Duke's dark eyes, or the strange warmth that had crept into his voice in the library. She saw him again at midday meal, though he did not join the staff table where she sat with Margaret and the other servants. Instead, she caught glimpses of him through the doorway, seated alone in the formal dining room, a single place setting at a table meant for 20. The sight struck her with an unexpected sadness. A man surrounded by so much wealth, so utterly alone. "He always eats alone," Margaret said quietly, following her gaze. "Even when his mother visits, he finds reasons to dine separately. Ever since." She stopped herself, and Elena did not press, sensing the topic was not hers to ask about. But the words lingered in her mind for the rest of the afternoon. Ever since what? What had happened to turn a man capable of quoting poetry into someone who could not bear to share a meal with his own family? As evening fell and the storm continued its relentless assault on the manor's windows, Elena found herself once more near the study, drawn by some instinct she could not explain. She told herself she only wished to return the book of poetry she had noticed him set down, to leave it somewhere he might find it again. But when she reached the doorway, she found Julian already there, seated by the fire in the very chair she had slept in the night before, staring into the flames with an expression of such profound loneliness that it stole the breath from her lungs. He looked up when he sensed her presence, and for once, he did not order her away. "Come in," he said quietly, "if you wish." Elena hesitated only a moment before stepping into the room, unaware that she was crossing a threshold far more significant than the physical one beneath her feet. Behind her, the storm raged on, trapping her within walls that held far more secrets than she yet understood, and before her sat a man whose carefully built walls, brick by brick, had already begun quietly, irreversibly, to fall. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that neither seemed eager to break. Elena stood near the doorway for a long moment, uncertain whether she had truly been invited, or whether her feet had simply carried her forward before her mind could object. Julian did not look away from the flames, but he gestured, almost absently, toward the chair opposite his own. "Sit, if you like. I promise not to accuse you of trespassing this time." There was the faintest trace of dry humor in his voice, so unexpected that Elena nearly smiled despite her nerves. She lowered herself into the chair, careful to keep her spine straight, painfully aware of the gulf between her worn dress and the fine furnishings surrounding her. "I came to return this," she said, holding out the small book of poetry. "I thought you might want it back." Julian's gaze finally left the fire and settled on the book in her hands. Something passed behind his eyes, quick and complicated, before he reached out to take it from her. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, and Elena felt a strange warmth travel up her arm that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you," he said simply, setting the book on the small table beside him without opening it. "Though I confess I had not thought of that book in years, until you found it this morning. May I ask why?" She regretted the question the instant it left her mouth, certain he would close himself off again, as he had in the library. But instead, Julian let out a long breath, and for the first time since she had met him, his shoulders lowered slightly, as though setting down a weight he had carried too long. "My mother read to me from that book every evening when I was a boy, before my father decided such things made me soft. Before he decided I needed to become someone harder, someone worthy of the title I would inherit." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I have not opened it since he died." "I am sorry," Elena said softly, and she meant it, though she sensed the words were inadequate for whatever pain lived behind them. "Do not be." "It was a long time ago." He said it too quickly, the practiced dismissal of a man who had repeated the phrase to himself so often it had become reflex rather than truth. Elena studied him in the firelight, noting the tension in his hands, the careful control in his voice that did not quite match the shadows in his eyes. She had grown up watching her mother hide pain behind brisk efficiency, stitching through exhaustion and grief alike without ever letting the mask slip. She recognized the same performance now, though dressed in far finer clothing. "My father died when I was 12, she said quietly, offering the truth without being asked, hoping it might ease whatever guarded thing sat between them. "A fever took him within a week. My mother never spoke of him again, not once, though I know she thinks of him every single day." Julian's eyes lifted to hers, surprise evident in his expression. He had not expected honesty offered so freely, without calculation, without the careful angling for sympathy or advantage that he had grown so used to from those who sought his favor. "How did you bear it?" he asked, and the question seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "I am not certain I have," Elena admitted. "I think perhaps grief is not something we bear so much as something we carry differently as time passes. It never truly leaves. It simply changes shape." "Do you think of him often?" Julian asked. "Your father?" "Every day," Elena said, "though not always in sorrow. Sometimes I remember the way he used to whistle while he mended fences, or the way he called my mother his finest thread, saying she held their whole household together the way good stitching holds a coat. Those memories do not hurt the way they once did. They have become something closer to company than to grief." "Company," Julian repeated, as though tasting the word for the first time. "I have never thought of grief that way. For me, it has always been a wall. Something to keep locked away, lest it break free and consume everything else." "Perhaps that is because you have never allowed it to simply exist beside you," Elena said gently. "Walls require constant tending, my lord. Company only requires that you let it sit with you a while." Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet held her fixed in place. "That is a wiser observation than most philosophers manage in entire volumes," he said finally. "I did not learn it from a book," Elena replied. "I learned it from watching my mother wake every morning and choose, again and again, to keep going." Something in Julian's expression cracked further, the stone giving way to something rawer beneath. He looked for a moment, less like the fearsome duke the county whispered about, and more like a man who had spent 5 years alone in a room built entirely from grief and expectation, waiting for someone to knock. "My wife," he said abruptly, the words seeming to escape before he could stop them, "died bringing our child into the world. Both of them, within the same hour. I was told, when I was young, that a man of my position does not weep, does not falter. So I did not. I simply stopped feeling anything at all, and it was easier that way. Easier for everyone." Elena's breath caught. She had heard whispers in the village of the Duke's tragic past, vague rumors twisted by gossip into something almost fantastical, but never anything so plain and devastating as the truth spoken now in his own quiet voice. "That is not easier," she said gently. "That is simply pain wearing a different disguise." Julian looked at her sharply, as though her words had struck somewhere deep and unguarded. For a moment, she feared she had overstepped. They would retreat once more behind his walls and order her from the room. Instead, he let out a breath that seemed to carry years of held tension with it. "No one has spoken to me this way in a very long time," he said. "Most people are too afraid of my title, or too eager to please me, to say anything true at all." "I have very little to lose by speaking plainly," Elena said, allowing a small, wry smile. "I am merely a seamstress's daughter trapped in your study by a snowstorm. What further harm could honesty possibly cause me?" That earned the faintest ghost of a smile from Julian, so unfamiliar on his face that Elena wondered how long it had been since he had allowed himself even that small expression. They talked long into the evening after that, the conversation drifting from grief to lighter things. Elena's love of reading, Julian's forgotten fondness for poetry, the small dreams she carried despite her circumstances, the duties that weighed on him despite his wealth. Margaret passed the study twice on her rounds and paused each time in the corridor, listening to the low murmur of voices and the occasional, astonishing sound of her master's genuine laughter, before continuing on with a small, satisfied smile of her own. Neither Elena nor Julian noticed the hours slipping away. It was only when the mantel clock struck 11 that Elena startled, realizing how late it had grown. "I should return to my room," she said, rising quickly. "Forgive me, my lord. I did not mean to intrude on your evening for so long." "You did not intrude," Julian said, and he too rose, standing closer to her than either had quite intended. In the firelight, his eyes had lost their usual coldness, replaced by something warmer, something almost vulnerable. "I cannot recall the last time I spoke so freely with anyone." "Perhaps," Elena said softly, "that is simply what happens when a stranger falls asleep in the wrong chair." Julian's lips curved, not quite a full smile but close enough to transform his entire face. "Perhaps," he agreed. She left the study that night with her heart beating strangely fast, unaware that in a distant wing of the manor, Lord Charles Vane had returned early from a visit to a neighboring estate, and stood now at the top of the staircase, having witnessed the warm light spilling from beneath the study door, and heard, faintly, the unmistakable sound of his cousin's laughter for the first time in 5 long years. Charles's expression, as he turned away toward his own chambers, held none of the household's growing warmth. Instead, it held only the cold calculation of a man who understood, immediately and completely, exactly what such a change might cost him. Morning brought no relief from the snow, though it brought something far more troubling to Ashford Manor in the form of Lord Charles Vane's carefully measured smile at the breakfast table. Elena had been invited, somewhat awkwardly, to join the family meal that morning at the Dowager Duchess's insistence, and she sat now in unfamiliar formality, acutely aware of every eye upon her. The Dowager Duchess Constance, a slender woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, had arrived the previous night after word reached her that her son's household sheltered an unexpected guest. She studied Elena now with open curiosity, though not unkindly. "So you are the young woman who fell asleep in my son's chair," Constance said, a faint smile playing at her lips. "I confess I did not think anyone possessed the courage to disturb his solitude so thoroughly." "It was an accident, Your Grace," Elena said quickly, feeling her cheeks warm. "I meant no disrespect. No need to apologize, child. From what Margaret tells me, it appears to have been rather a fortunate accident." Constance's gaze flicked briefly toward her son, who kept his eyes carefully fixed on his plate, though the faint tension in his jaw suggested he had heard every word. Charles cleared his throat, drawing attention toward himself with practiced ease. "How fascinating, cousin, that you have grown so hospitable overnight. I do not recall you extending such warmth to guests before." "The circumstances were unusual," Julian said evenly, though something guarded returned to his voice. "Miss Whitmore was caught in the storm through no fault of her own. Common decency required shelter, nothing more." "Of course," Charles said smoothly, though his eyes lingered on Elena a moment too long, calculating something she could not read. "How admirable of you to remember common decency after all these years." The comment carried an edge sharp enough that even Constance's smile faltered slightly. Elena sensed undercurrents in the conversation she did not fully understand, old tensions between cousins that predated her arrival by years. She kept her eyes on her plate and said nothing, wishing fervently that the storm would break so she could return home and remove herself from whatever quiet battle simmered beneath the surface of this elegant breakfast. After the meal, Constance found a moment to draw Elena aside in the corridor. her expression softening from its earlier composed formality. "Forgive my son's cousin," Constance said quietly. "Charles has always been rather too concerned with matters that do not belong to him. Pay him no mind." "May I ask, Your Grace," Elena said carefully, "what matters he refers to?" Constance studied her for a long moment before answering. "My son is the last of his line, Miss Whitmore. Should he never remarry, should he never have an heir, the title and everything attached to it would eventually pass to Charles. My son's grief, difficult as it has been to witness these 5 years, has been rather convenient for his cousin's future prospects." Elena's stomach turned cold at the implication. "You believe Lord Charles wishes the Duke to remain as he was?" "I believe," Constance said, choosing her words with obvious care, "that some men prefer a world that remains predictable, even when that world causes pain to those they claim to love. I have watched my son disappear into his grief for 5 years, Miss Whitmore, and I confess that watching him laugh again last night, even briefly, gave me more hope than I have felt in a very long time." Her eyes met Elena's with unexpected intensity. "I would ask that you not dismiss whatever has begun here, however unlikely the circumstances of its beginning." Before Elena could formulate any response to such a startling request, Constance patted her hand gently and moved off down the corridor, leaving Elena alone with thoughts far too large and complicated for a snowstorm-stranded seamstress's daughter to properly hold. She spent the remainder of the morning attempting to distract herself with small tasks, though her mind kept drifting back to the previous evening, to the warmth in Julian's voice as he spoke of grief and poetry, to the way his careful walls had, however briefly, allowed her a glimpse of the man beneath. She told herself firmly that such thoughts were foolish, that a duke and a seamstress's daughter belonged to entirely different worlds, and that whatever strange connection the storm had forced between them would dissolve the moment the roads cleared and she returned to her ordinary life. But when she encountered Julian again that afternoon, quite by accident, in the Manor's small conservatory where she had gone to admire the few winter flowers still blooming under glass, she found that her resolve crumbled rather more easily than she had anticipated. "You found my mother's favorite room," Julian said, stepping in from the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that seemed almost formal, though his eyes held none of the coldness she had first encountered 2 nights before. "It is beautiful," Elena said. "I did not expect such life in the middle of winter. My mother insisted on it years ago. She said a house without something growing was simply a mausoleum with better furniture." A ghost of that same rare smile touched his lips. "I confess I had forgotten how much I once enjoyed sitting here myself." They walked slowly among the flowering plants, the conversation drifting easily between them, as it had the night before, though this time carrying a lightness that surprised them both. Elena found herself laughing at a dry observation Julian made about his least favorite relatives, and the sound of her own laughter, unguarded and genuine, seemed to startle something loose in his expression. "I have not made anyone laugh in longer than I can remember," he admitted, watching her with something like wonder. "Then you have been keeping poor company," Elena said lightly, though her heart beat strangely fast beneath the teasing words. They did not notice, as they lingered among the winter blooms, that Charles observed them from the garden path outside the conservatory glass, his expression carefully composed into pleasant neutrality, even as his mind worked quickly through the implications of what he witnessed. A duke laughing. A duke smiling at a servant girl as though she held the answer to some question he had long since stopped asking. Charles turned away from the glass and made his way toward the stables, already composing in his mind the letter he intended to send that very afternoon to Lady Priscilla Grant, a woman he knew possessed both the motivation and the ruthlessness necessary to ensure that whatever had begun between the Duke and this inconvenient seamstress's daughter would not be permitted to continue. That evening, over a solitary dinner he took no pleasure in, Charles allowed himself to remember exactly why the Ashford title mattered so deeply to him. His own father had squandered what little fortune their branch of the family once held, leaving Charles with a fine name and almost nothing else to support it. He had spent a decade cultivating patience, attending every family gathering with dutiful regularity, offering condolences at Julian's wedding, and again, more sincerely than anyone realized, at the funeral that followed so soon after. He had told himself in the quiet years since that his patience would eventually be rewarded, that a man broken as thoroughly as his cousin would never risk his heart again, and that the title would, in time, settle naturally upon shoulders willing to carry it. He did not consider himself a villain, he told himself, as he finished his meal alone in a house far smaller than the one he believed should rightfully be his, that he was simply a man protecting what circumstance and birth order had unfairly denied him. It was a story he had rehearsed so many times that he had nearly convinced himself of its fairness, and it was that same story he carried with him to his writing desk that night as he began his letter to Priscilla, choosing his words with the same careful precision he applied to every part of his long and patient campaign. The storm outside had begun, at last, to weaken, the snow falling more gently now than it had in days. But within the walls of Ashford Manor, a different kind of storm was only just gathering its strength, and neither Elena nor Julian, caught in the fragile warmth of their unexpected connection, understood yet how fiercely it would soon break upon them both. Lady Priscilla Grant read Charles's letter twice, before setting it down upon her dressing table, with deliberate care. Her reflection in the mirror remained composed, though something sharp flickered behind her pale eyes. For 3 years she had positioned herself carefully within Julian Ashford's social circle, attending every gathering he might possibly attend, cultivating friendship with his mother, waiting with the patience of a woman who understood that grief, however deep, eventually gave way to loneliness, and loneliness, given enough time, gave way to need. She had not anticipated a seamstress's daughter arriving to disrupt 3 years of careful strategy in a single snowstorm. A servant girl, she murmured to her reflection, testing the words for their absurdity. Charles must be mistaken. But Charles was rarely mistaken about matters that affected his own interests, and Priscilla trusted his account precisely because she understood his motivations aligned so neatly with her own. Neither of them wished to see Julian Ashford find happiness with anyone but the person each had selected for that role. Charles required Julian to remain airless and detached. Priscilla required Julian to eventually turn to her, as she had long ago decided he would, once enough time had passed for grief to soften into practical necessity. She began composing her response before the ink on Charles's letter had even fully dried, already imagining the various ways such an inconvenient obstacle might be efficiently removed. Priscilla had known Julian since childhood, their families' estates bordering one another across a shared stretch of woodland, and she had watched him grow from a quiet, poetry-loving boy into a young man of considerable promise, before grief had hollowed him out entirely. She remembered, with the particular clarity reserved for memories one revisits often, the summer before his marriage, when she had allowed herself to believe, for one foolish season, that he might choose her, instead of the quiet, unremarkable young woman his father had ultimately selected for him. She had swallowed that disappointment with practiced grace, attended the wedding with a smile no one questioned, and waited, patient as stone, for circumstance to eventually favor her again. When Julian's wife died, Priscilla had grieved for him sincerely, in her own way, though the grief had never fully smothered the small, persistent hope that time might yet deliver what fate had once denied her. 5 years of careful attendance at every gathering, every dinner, every occasion where she might cross his path and remind him, gently and without pressure, that comfort and companionship still existed for those willing to accept it, had cost her more patience than most people ever fully appreciated. She was not a cruel woman by nature, or so she told herself, only a determined one, and determination, she had long ago decided, was simply patience with a sharper edge. The arrival of Elena Whitmore threatened to unravel 5 years of careful investment in a matter of days, and Priscilla found that realization far more infuriating than she cared to admit even to herself. Back at Ashford Manor, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white beneath a pale winter sun. Elena stood at her window that morning studying the cleared sky with mixed emotions, relief that she could finally return to her mother warring with a reluctance she did not fully wish to examine too closely. Margaret found her still standing there when she arrived with the morning tray. "The roads should be passable by tomorrow," Margaret said, watching Elena's face carefully. "You'll be able to return home soon." "Yes," Elena said, though the word came out quieter than she intended. "My mother will be relieved. And will you be relieved as well?" Margaret asked, her tone gentle but knowing. Elena did not answer immediately, and Margaret, wise enough not to press further, simply set down the tray and left her alone with thoughts too tangled to easily untangle. She found Julian later that day in the study, standing before the window with the book of poetry once more in his hands, though this time it lay open, and she could see he had actually been reading it rather than simply holding it as a relic of memory. "The roads are clearing," she said softly from the doorway. Julian turned, and something in his expression, some careful mask he had begun to reassemble since the previous evening, faltered visibly at the sight of her. "So I have been told. I should return home tomorrow then. My mother needs me. And I have imposed on your hospitality long enough already." "You have imposed on nothing," Julian said, setting the book down and crossing the room toward her with a directness that made her breath catch. "Elena, these past days have been—" He paused, searching for words that seemed to elude a man usually so precise in his speech. I had forgotten what it felt like to simply speak with someone, to be seen, rather than simply observed for my title. "I have felt the same," Elena admitted quietly, unable to hold back the honesty any longer, despite every practical instinct warning her against it. "But my lord, we both know the world does not permit what has grown between us these past days. I am the daughter of a seamstress. You are a duke. Whatever this is, whatever it has become, it cannot survive outside these walls." "Why not?" Julian asked, and the simple, direct question hung in the air between them, heavier than either had expected. Before Elena could formulate any response, a sharp knock interrupted them, and Margaret entered, with visible urgency in her expression. "My lord, forgive the intrusion, but Lady Priscilla Grant has arrived unannounced, along with Lord Charles. They insist on speaking with you immediately, regarding a matter they describe as most urgent." Julian's jaw tightened, the warmth that had begun spreading through his features hardening once more into something guarded and wary. "Send them to the drawing room. I will be along shortly." As Margaret departed, Julian turned back to Elena, his expression conflicted. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Whatever they intend to discuss, I suspect it concerns you, and I would prefer you not face it alone." Elena's stomach twisted with sudden apprehension, though she nodded and followed him toward the drawing room, uncertain what storm awaited them now that the one outside had finally passed. They found Priscilla seated with elegant composure upon the drawing room's finest chair, while Charles stood near the fireplace wearing an expression of carefully manufactured concern. Both looked up as Julian entered, Priscilla's gaze sweeping briefly, dismissively, over Elena before returning to Julian with practiced warmth. "Julian, darling, I came the moment I heard the terrible rumors circulating through the county," Priscilla said, rising to clasp his hands in greeting before he could withdraw them. "They say a servant girl has been living under your roof these past days, quite alone with you, no chaperone present. I could not simply sit by and allow such damaging talk to spread unchecked without coming to see the truth myself." "There is no truth to concern yourself with," Julian said coolly, extracting his hands from her grip. "Miss Whitmore was stranded by the storm, as was half the county. My mother was present throughout her stay." "Your mother arrived only yesterday, cousin," Charles interjected smoothly. "Before that, I understand you and Miss Whitmore spent rather a great deal of time entirely alone. What exactly are you suggesting?" Julian's voice carried a warning edge that Elena had not heard since their first encounter in the study. "Only that reputation, once damaged, proves rather difficult to repair," Priscilla said, her tone honeyed, even as her eyes glittered with something far colder. "For your sake, and indeed for the girl's own sake, it might be wisest if she returned home immediately, before further talk spreads. I would hate to see such an unfortunate scandal attach itself to your name, Julian, after everything you have already endured." Elena felt the weight of the room's attention shift toward her, felt herself shrinking beneath the calculated cruelty disguised as concern. She understood with sudden clarity exactly what game was being played, and exactly how little power she held to counter it. "Perhaps," she said quietly, before Julian could respond, "Lady Priscilla is correct. I should return home as soon as the roads allow." Julian turned to her sharply, something like betrayal flickering across his features before understanding replaced it. He studied her for a long moment, recognizing the careful retreat for what it was, a strategic withdrawal rather than genuine agreement. "The roads will be passable tomorrow," he said finally, his voice controlled once more, though his eyes, when they met Elena's, held a silent promise that this conversation, this particular battle, was far from finished. "Miss Whitmore will return home then, as originally planned. Now, if you will excuse us, I believe you have concluded your urgent business." Priscilla's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the clear dismissal, though she recovered quickly, gathering her composure like a cloak. "Of course, darling, I only wish to help." She swept from the room with Charles trailing behind her, though not before Charles cast one final calculating glance toward Elena, a look that promised this was merely the opening move in a much longer game. Once they had gone, Julian turned to Elena, his expression softening. "You do not need to leave because of their poison." "I think," Elena said carefully, "that perhaps I do need to leave, my lord, not because of what they said, but because of what is true. I do not belong in your world, and remaining here only invites the kind of talk that could damage you far more than it could ever damage me." "And if I told you," Julian said, stepping closer, his voice low and unexpectedly rough with emotion, "that I do not care what the world says?" That these past days with you have shown me more of myself than the past 5 years combined? Elena's heart ached with the impossible weight of his words, torn between the truth of her growing feelings and the practical reality of a world that would never permit them to simply exist together without consequence. Then I would tell you, my lord, that feelings, however true, do not erase the walls the world has built between us. She left him standing alone in the drawing room, her own eyes burning with unshed tears, unaware that outside, in the shadow of the garden hedge, Charles watched the exchange through the window with grim satisfaction, already calculating his next move to ensure that whatever fragile thing had grown between his cousin and the seamstress's daughter would be permanently, thoroughly destroyed before it could take root any deeper. The snow had stopped falling, but the true storm at Ashford Manor, Elena understood with growing dread, had only just begun. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay awake in the small guest room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Priscilla and Charles had spoken, every calculated glance, every honeyed threat disguised as concern. By the time dawn broke gray and cold over the manor, she had resolved to leave as early as possible, before the household stirred, before she could be tempted once more by the warmth in Julian's eyes to stay somewhere she did not belong. She packed her few belongings quietly and made her way toward the kitchen entrance, hoping to slip away before anyone noticed. But Margaret was already awake, standing at the door with a basket of provisions and an expression that held no surprise at all. "I thought you might try to leave without a proper goodbye," Margaret said, holding out the basket. "Bread and cheese for the journey, and a jar of broth for your mother." "Thank you," Elena said, her voice unsteady. "For everything, Margaret. You have been kinder to me than I had any right to expect." "Kindness is easy to give to someone who deserves it, dear." Margaret studied her carefully. "You are leaving without saying goodbye to him." "It is better this way," Elena said, "for both of us." Margaret did not argue, though her expression suggested she disagreed entirely. She simply squeezed Elena's hand and stepped aside to let her pass into the cold morning air, the snow crunching beneath her worn boots as she made her way down the long drive toward the village road. She had walked perhaps a mile when she heard hoofbeats behind her, fast and urgent, cutting through the crisp winter silence. She turned, half expecting Charles come to ensure her departure, and found instead Julian himself, dismounting from his horse with an urgency that startled her. "You left without a word," he said, his breath visible in the cold air, his eyes searching her face with something between hurt and desperation. "I thought it would be easier," Elena admitted. "For both of us, my lord." "Stop calling me that," Julian said, closing the distance between them. "You have called me by my name in private these past days. Do not retreat behind formality now, as though the past days meant nothing." "They meant everything," Elena said, and the words broke free before she could stop them, carrying with them all the fear and longing she had tried so hard to suppress through the sleepless night. "That is precisely the problem, Julian. They meant everything to me, and I cannot allow myself to want something the world will never permit me to have." "The world," Julian said fiercely, "does not decide what I permit myself to want. I have spent 5 years allowing the world, my father's expectations, my own grief, to dictate every choice I made. I will not allow it to dictate this. And what of Lady Priscilla? What of your cousin, and the scandal they threaten?" "Let them threaten whatever they wish," Julian said. "I have buried a wife, Elena. I have buried a child I never held. I have spent 5 years so afraid of feeling anything that I forgot what it meant to be alive at all, until a storm blew a stranger into my chair and reminded me. I will not throw that away, because two people who care nothing for my happiness disapprove." Elena's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. "I am afraid," she admitted quietly, "not of the storm outside, but of the one waiting for us if I stay. Charles and Priscilla will not simply accept this. They will fight it, and I fear what such a fight might cost you." "Then let us face it together," Julian said, taking her hands in his grip warm despite the winter cold surrounding them. "I am not asking you to solve this today. I am only asking you not to disappear into the snow as though these past days were nothing more than a dream we must both forget." For a long moment, Elena said nothing, torn between fear and the fierce, undeniable pull she felt toward this man who had, against every expectation, shown her more honesty in a handful of days than most people offered in a lifetime. "My mother," she said finally. "She needs me. She is ill, and I have already been away longer than I intended." "Then let me help her," Julian said immediately. "Send for the physician from the village. Whatever medicine or care she requires, I will provide it without condition or expectation. Not to buy your affection, Elena, but because it is the right thing to do," and because I care about what matters to you." Elena studied him, searching for any trace of calculation in his offer, and finding only sincerity so raw it nearly undid her composure entirely. "You would do that? For a woman you have known only a handful of days?" "I would do that," Julian said quietly, "for a woman who taught me, in a handful of days, how to feel again." She did not have an answer for such a declaration, so she simply nodded, and Julian, understanding the smaller victory this represented, did not press further. He arranged for his own carriage to carry her the remaining distance home, promising to send the village physician within the hour, and as Elena settled into the carriage, watching Ashford Manor grow smaller behind her through the frosted window, she found herself already counting the hours until she might see it again. She did not know that behind her, in the manor she had just left, Charles had risen early enough to witness the entire exchange from an upstairs window, his expression twisting into something far darker than mere irritation as he watched his cousin's carriage disappear down the snow-covered drive. He returned to his chambers and began composing a second letter to Priscilla immediately, his earlier plans no longer sufficient given what he had just witnessed. Simple gossip and social pressure, he now understood, would not be enough to separate Julian from a woman who had clearly worked her way beneath his cousin's carefully constructed defenses. Something more decisive would be required, and Charles, staring out at the winter landscape with cold calculation, began planning exactly what that decisive action might be. The physician arrived at Elena's small cottage within the hour, exactly as Julian had promised, examining her mother with careful attention and prescribing medicine that Elena could never have afforded on her own. Her mother, weak but alert, studied her daughter with curious eyes as the physician packed his instruments. "A duke's physician," her mother said once they were alone, her voice still frail but sharpening with maternal suspicion. "Elena, what exactly happened during that storm?" Elena found herself recounting the entire strange, impossible tale, the accidental trespass, the unexpected kindness, the conversations that had grown into something she could not quite name but could not deny either. Her mother listened without interrupting, her expression growing increasingly thoughtful as the story unfolded. "Be careful, my love," her mother said finally, taking Elena's hand in her own thin fingers. "Men of his station do not always understand the cost their affections carry for women of ours. I do not say this to discourage you, only to ask that you protect your heart as carefully as you would protect anything else precious to you." "I know, Mother. I am trying." "And is it working?" her mother asked, with the faint, knowing smile of someone who had once been young and foolish and in love herself. Elena laughed despite herself, despite the worry still coiled tight in her chest. "Not particularly well, I confess." Elena's mother recovered steadily over the following days, the physician's medicine easing the cough that had plagued her for weeks, and color slowly returning to her thin cheeks. She insisted, despite Elena's protests, on rising from her bed to help with the household's mending work as soon as she was able, unwilling to let her daughter carry the burden of their small trade entirely alone. "You have done enough worrying over me," her mother said one afternoon, threading a needle with practiced ease despite her still trembling hands. "Tell me instead what troubles your mind, for I have watched you stare out that window a dozen times today, without once picking up your own needle." Elena set down the shirt she had been pretending to mend, and sighed. "I do not know how to explain it, Mother. Everything about him should trouble me. His title, his world, the certainty that people like Lady Priscilla will never accept a seamstress's daughter standing beside a duke. And yet when I think of leaving all of it behind, of never seeing him again, something in my chest aches as though I have already lost something precious." Her mother studied her for a long moment, setting aside her own work entirely. "Your father once told me something I have never forgotten. He said that love rarely asks permission before it arrives, and that the wisest thing a person can do is decide, honestly, whether they are willing to bear its cost, rather than pretend the cost does not exist. Only you can answer that question, Elena. But do not let fear alone make the decision for you." Elena thought of those words often in the days that followed, turning them over in her mind as she went about her ordinary tasks, the fear of scandal weighing against the memory of Julian's voice in the firelight, his honesty, the way he had looked at her as though she were the first true thing he had seen in years. Over the following days, Julian found reasons to visit the village more frequently than he had in years, always with some practical excuse, checking on tenant matters, inspecting the mill, though everyone in the household, and increasingly everyone in the village itself, understood the true reason for his sudden interest in matters he had long delegated entirely to his stewards. Each visit brought him, inevitably, past Elena's small cottage, and each time, he found some reason to stop, to inquire after her mother's health, to linger longer than any practical matter required. The village began to talk, as villages inevitably do, and word of the Duke's unusual attentions toward the seamstress's daughter spread with remarkable speed through the county's social circles, eventually reaching ears far less sympathetic than Margaret's or Constance's. Lady Priscilla received the news with barely contained fury, storming into Charles's study at his own estate with a letter clutched in her white-knuckled hand. "He visits her cottage nearly every day," she said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "The entire village speaks of nothing else. This has gone far beyond a passing infatuation born of storm and circumstance, Charles. We must act, and we must act decisively, before this ridiculous attachment becomes something neither of us can undo." "I agree entirely," Charles said, gesturing for her to sit, his own expression carrying none of her visible emotion, only cold, patient calculation. "Fortunately, I believe I have devised precisely the solution our situation requires." He outlined his plan with the careful precision of a man who had spent years studying his cousin's household, its routines, its vulnerabilities. A valuable heirloom, a family brooch belonging to Julian's late mother's collection, would go missing from the manor. Circumstantial evidence, carefully and quietly arranged, would point toward Elena, whose recent presence in the house provided the perfect opportunity and motive in the eyes of anyone inclined to suspect a poor seamstress's daughter of theft. "He will have no choice but to dismiss her," Charles said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Whatever affection he holds for her will not survive an accusation of theft from his own household, not with his position and reputation to consider, and once she is gone, thoroughly disgraced and unable to return, this entire foolish infatuation will fade as quickly as it began." Priscilla considered the plan with the careful scrutiny of a woman who had learned long ago never to trust anyone's competence but her own, before finally allowing a slow, satisfied smile to spread across her elegant features. "It is elegant in its simplicity," she admitted. "When shall we begin?" "Soon," Charles said, "before this attachment grows any deeper than it already has." Neither of them noticed, as they finalized their scheme in the privacy of Charles's study, that a young housemaid passing in the corridor outside had paused at the sound of Elena's name spoken in such conspiratorial tones, and had lingered just long enough to catch the shape, if not every detail, of the plot being woven against a woman she had come to consider, in the short time she had known her, a genuinely kind and honest soul. That housemaid, whose name was Grace, had once worked briefly at Ashford Manor, before taking a position in Charles's household, and she still maintained a quiet friendship with several of Margaret's staff. What she had overheard troubled her deeply enough that she resolved, once her duties allowed, to find some way to send word of the danger gathering against Elena Whitmore, though she could not yet know whether such a warning would arrive in time to prevent whatever storm Charles and Priscilla intended to unleash. The brooch disappeared 3 days later, discovered missing from the Dowager Duchess's jewelry case during a routine inventory conducted by one of the household staff. Word spread through Ashford Manor with startling speed, and by that afternoon, whispers had already begun circulating that pointed, with suspicious convenience, toward the seamstress's daughter who had stayed under the manor's roof during the storm. Julian heard the accusation first from Margaret, who delivered the news with visible distress, her hands twisting the edge of her apron as she spoke. "It cannot be true," Julian said immediately, his voice hard with certainty. "Elena would never steal from this house." "I do not believe it either, my lord," Margaret said. "But Lord Charles insists the timing cannot be coincidence, and several of the newer staff seem inclined to agree with him. Where is Charles now?" "In the drawing room, my lord, along with Lady Priscilla, who arrived not an hour ago. They are asking that the matter be reported to the constable immediately." Julian's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury as he made his way toward the drawing room, finding Charles and Priscilla waiting, with expressions of carefully manufactured concern that did nothing to disguise the satisfaction lurking beneath. "Ah, Julian," Charles said as he entered. "I am afraid we have rather troubling news. My aunt's brooch has gone missing, and given the timing, given that it disappeared so soon after your seamstress friend's departure, I fear the conclusion is rather difficult to avoid." "Elena left this manor nearly a week ago," Julian said coldly. "She has not returned since. How exactly do you propose she managed to steal an item from a jewelry case she had no access to during her stay, and no opportunity to reach afterward?" Charles's expression flickered, only briefly, before smoothing back into practiced concern. Perhaps an accomplice among the staff. It would not be the first time a servant's sympathy was exploited by someone seeking to improve her circumstances. "This is absurd," Julian said. "I will not entertain such baseless accusations against a woman whose character I have come to know and trust. Trust, Priscilla repeated, her voice carrying gentle, poisonous concern. Julian, darling, I understand your affection for the girl clouds your judgment, but surely you must consider the possibility, however painful, that her presence here was not entirely as innocent as it appeared. A poor girl, suddenly finding herself alone in a wealthy household during a storm, presented with countless opportunities for temptation. It would hardly be the first such story history has recorded. Julian felt something cold and furious settle in his chest, though he forced himself to remain composed rather than give Charles and Priscilla the satisfaction of witnessing his anger unleashed. I will investigate this matter myself, he said finally, thoroughly, and without the prejudgment you both seem so eager to apply. Until I have concluded that investigation, I expect no accusations to be repeated outside this room, and certainly none reported to the constable. Charles opened his mouth to protest, but something in Julian's expression, a cold determination that neither cousin nor scheming noblewoman had anticipated, silenced whatever objection he intended to raise. Before beginning his formal investigation, Julian sought out his mother, finding Constance in the small sitting room she favored for her correspondence. She looked up as he entered, and something in his expression told her immediately that the accusations against Elena had already reached him. You do not believe it, Constance said, not as a question but as a statement of simple fact. I do not, Julian said. But I intend to prove it beyond any possible doubt, not merely for my own peace of mind, but so that no one in this county can ever again whisper her name alongside the word thief. Good, Constance said firmly, setting down her pen. I raised you to value truth above convenience, Julian, even when your father tried his best to teach you otherwise. Whatever you require of me in this matter, you have it. Her support steadied something in him, a quiet confirmation that he was not imagining the injustice being done, and he left her sitting room with a clearer resolve than he had carried in years. Julian began his investigation that same afternoon, questioning every member of staff with a thoroughness that surprised even Margaret, who had not seen her master apply himself to any household matter with such personal attention in years. He examined the jewelry case itself, noting the lock showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting whoever had removed the brooch possessed either a key or access that only a small number of trusted individuals could claim. He questioned the newer staff members first, those who had joined the household most recently and who seemed, according to Margaret's careful observation, most eager to repeat and embellish the accusations against Elena. One young footman, under careful and patient questioning, finally admitted, with visible reluctance, that Lord Charles himself had suggested to him, quite casually during a conversation several days prior, that Elena Whitmore's character seemed rather suspicious, and that perhaps the staff should watch her more closely should any valuables go missing during her stay. Julian's expression darkened considerably at this revelation, though he kept his questioning calm and methodical, gathering every detail with the patience of a man determined to uncover the truth rather than simply confirm his own suspicions. Further investigation revealed that Charles himself had visited the manor twice during the week the brooch went missing, ostensibly to discuss estate matters, though the timing of these visits, Julian noted grimly, aligned rather too conveniently with the period during which the jewelry case had last been confirmed intact. By evening, Julian had assembled enough evidence to feel confident in his conclusions, though he required one final piece of confirmation before confronting his cousin directly. That confirmation arrived unexpectedly in the form of Grace, the housemaid who had once served at Ashford Manor and who now, having finally found the opportunity she had been seeking, requested an urgent private audience with the Duke. She recounted, with visible nervousness but unwavering clarity, the conversation she had overheard between Charles and Priscilla in his study, the plot to plant suspicion against Elena through the calculated disappearance of a valuable heirloom, the careful manipulation of household gossip to ensure the blame would fall, inevitably and conveniently, upon a woman whose only crime had been surviving a snowstorm in the wrong chair. Thank you, Grace, Julian said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. You have shown remarkable courage in coming forward. I will ensure you suffer no consequence from Lord Charles for your honesty. Armed with this knowledge, Julian summoned Charles to his study that very night, dismissing the servants and closing the door firmly behind them both. The brooch, Julian said without preamble, is currently hidden somewhere in your possession, is it not? Charles's carefully composed expression faltered, just slightly, before he attempted to recover his footing. I have no idea what you mean, cousin. I am as troubled by this theft as anyone. Do not insult my intelligence further than you already have, Julian said, his voice deadly quiet. I have spoken with the staff, Charles. I know of your conversations suggesting suspicion toward Elena before the brooch even disappeared. I know of your visits to the manor during the precise window when the jewelry case was last confirmed secure, and I have a witness willing to testify that you and Priscilla conspired together to fabricate evidence against a woman who has done nothing but show me more genuine kindness than either of you have managed in years." Charles's expression finally crumbled, the mask of concerned cousin dissolving into something far more bitter and desperate. "You would choose her over your own blood, over the inheritance that should rightfully secure my future, given that you have shown no interest in remarrying or producing an heir in 5 long years?" "So this was never about the brooch at all," Julian said, understanding crystallizing with cold clarity. "This was about ensuring I remained exactly as broken as I have been these past 5 years, so that your inheritance remained secure." "Can you blame me?" Charles said, his voice rising with barely controlled desperation. "I have spent years planning my future around the reasonable assumption that you would never recover from your grief, that this estate would eventually pass to me as it should, and then a servant girl falls asleep in your chair, and suddenly everything I have carefully planned stands at risk of unraveling entirely." "Your plans," Julian said coldly, "were built upon my suffering, Charles. That is not merely selfish. It is cruel beyond anything I believed, even you capable of." "I told myself it was fair," Charles said, some of the fight draining from his voice, replaced by something closer to weary honesty. "I told myself that a man who could no longer feel anything at all had no true use for the title, or the estate that came with it, that I could put both to better purpose than a ghost wandering his own halls. It was easier to believe that than to admit I simply wanted what was never mine to take." "You could have built your own life, Charles," Julian said, some of his own anger softening into something closer to genuine sorrow. "You have wit and connections, and more advantages than most men are given. Instead, you chose to wait for mine to fail." "Waiting was easier," Charles admitted quietly. "Building is harder than waiting ever was." Julian said nothing further to that, though the admission lingered in the room long after the words themselves had faded, a small, sad truth neither of them could undo with any amount of further conversation that night. He crossed to the study door and called for Margaret, who entered promptly, clearly having anticipated the summons. "Charles will be leaving Ashford Manor tonight," Julian said. "He is no longer welcome under this roof, and I will be reviewing whatever inheritance provisions might yet be altered to ensure he understands the full consequence of tonight's revelations." Charles's face drained of color as the reality of his situation settled over him fully. "Julian, be reasonable." "I have been nothing but reasonable for 5 years," Julian said. "That ends tonight." He turned away, effectively dismissing his cousin, and did not look back as Charles was escorted from the manor into the cold winter night, his careful schemes finally, completely undone. Word of Charles's disgrace and the true circumstances of the missing brooch, recovered from his own chambers the following morning exactly as Julian had suspected, spread through the county with the same speed that the original false accusations had traveled. Lady Priscilla, upon learning of Charles's exposure, quietly withdrew from county society for several weeks, her own reputation suffering considerably, once her involvement in the scheme became known through Grace's testimony and the careful investigation Julian had conducted. Julian rode to Elena's cottage the very next morning, arriving before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, unable to wait a moment longer than necessary to see her again, and to make right the injustice that had nearly been done in her name. Elena opened the door to find him standing there, snow dusting his dark coat, his expression carrying none of the coldness that had once defined him, and everything of the transformation the past weeks had wrought. "Julian," she said, surprise evident in her voice, "what has happened?" "Everything," he said simply. "And I need to tell you all of it." He told her everything, standing there on the small porch of her cottage with the morning sun beginning to warm the frost-covered ground, the plot uncovered, Charles's disgrace, the truth finally brought into the light after threatening to bury her under a lie she had never earned. Elena listened in stunned silence, her hand pressed to her mouth as the full weight of how close she had come to ruin settled over her. "I am so sorry," Julian said, taking her hands in his. "You suffered the threat of that accusation because of my own blindness to what my cousin was capable of. I should have protected you from it before it ever reached you. You could not have known," Elena said softly, though gratitude and something warmer still shone plainly in her eyes. "What matters is that you found the truth, and that you fought for it." "I would fight for you against far worse than a jealous cousin and a scheming noblewoman," Julian said, and something in his voice, steady and certain in a way she had never heard from him before, made her breath catch entirely. "Elena, these past weeks have shown me something I believed I had lost forever, the day I buried my wife and child. I did not think I would ever feel whole again, ever laugh again, ever want anything beyond simply surviving each gray day as it came. And then a storm blew you into my chair, and by morning, I was no longer the same man who had fallen asleep alone the night before. Elena's eyes filled with tears, though this time they carried none of the fear or grief of recent days, only overwhelming hope. Julian, I am not asking you to become a duchess, he said quickly, as though the words had been building in him for days and could no longer be contained. I am not asking you to change who you are, or to pretend the differences between our worlds do not exist. I am simply asking whether you might consider building a new world with me, one where those differences matter far less than what we have found together. Are you asking me to marry you? Elena said, half laughing, half crying, the absurdity and wonder of the moment overwhelming her entirely. I am asking exactly that, Julian said, a smile breaking across his face so genuine and unguarded that it transformed him entirely from the cold duke the county had once whispered about into someone Elena barely recognized, and loved completely all the same. Though I confess I have never proposed marriage before, and I am uncertain I am doing it correctly. You are doing it perfectly, Elena said, laughing through her tears as she stepped into his embrace. The cottage door forgotten behind her, her mother watching with quiet joy from the window, the entire cold winter world around them suddenly warm with possibility. Yes, Julian. Yes, I will marry you. News of the engagement spread through the county with remarkable speed, carrying with it the full story of Charles's disgrace and the courage Elena had shown throughout the ordeal. The Dowager Duchess Constance received the announcement with tears of genuine joy, embracing Elena as warmly as she might have embraced a daughter she had always hoped to have. Margaret, upon hearing the news, declared to the entire staff that she had known from the very first morning, watching her master's face as he stood over a sleeping stranger in his study chair, that something extraordinary had begun that snowy night, though she had never imagined it would end in quite so happy a fashion. In the weeks between the proposal and the wedding, Elena found herself navigating a world entirely unfamiliar to her, learning the names of distant relatives, the proper forms of address for visiting nobility, the countless small customs that governed a life she had never expected to lead. Constance took it upon herself to guide these lessons personally, refusing to hand the task to any hired instructor, insisting that Elena needed no polishing beyond what her own good sense already provided. You must understand, Constance told her one afternoon in the conservatory, the same room where Julian and Elena had first laughed together among the winter blooms, that some among the county's finest families will never fully accept you, regardless of how gracefully you learn to hold a teacup or address a countess. Their opinion, I have found, matters a good deal less than one imagines it will. I worry more for Julian's sake than my own, Elena admitted. I do not wish to become a burden to him, a source of whispered scandal he must constantly defend. My son spent 5 years as a source of whispered scandal, for an entirely different reason, Constance said gently. Grief made him a curiosity, then a source of pity, then eventually simply a sad rumor people repeated at dinner parties when conversation grew thin. I would far rather he be whispered about for finding happiness than for losing it entirely. She took Elena's hand warmly. Let them whisper, my dear. We shall simply not be listening. Elena also spent those weeks preparing her mother for the change that was coming, arranging for her to move into a comfortable cottage on the Ashford estate itself, close enough that Elena could visit freely, far enough that her mother retained her own independence and the small dignities she valued so highly. Her mother accepted the arrangement with tearful gratitude, though she extracted a firm promise from Julian, delivered with the same directness she had once used to negotiate fair prices for her mending work, that her daughter would never be made to feel ashamed of where she came from. I would not dream of it, Julian told her solemnly. Elena's beginnings are precisely what taught me how to see clearly again. I have no wish to erase them, only to build something new alongside them. The wedding took place in early spring, when the last traces of winter finally gave way to the first green shoots of new growth across the county. Elena wore a gown of simple elegance, refusing anything too grand despite Constance's gentle insistence that a duchess's wedding dress ought to reflect her new station. Julian stood waiting for her at the altar with an expression the assembled guests had never before witnessed on his face, open joy without a trace of the careful guardedness that had defined him for 5 long years. Lady Priscilla did not attend, having quietly relocated to a distant relative's estate following the scandal of Charles's exposed scheme, her own ambitions permanently thwarted by her involvement in his cruel plot. Charles himself had been formally removed from any claim to the Ashford inheritance, his disgrace complete and irreversible, a fitting consequence for a man who had built his entire future upon the continued suffering of someone he claimed to love as family. In the years that followed, Ashford Manor transformed as thoroughly as its master had. The formal dining room, once home to Julian's solitary meals, now rang regularly with laughter and conversation, as Elena insisted on family dinners that included staff and family alike, breaking down the rigid formality that had once defined every corner of the house. The library, where Julian had first shown Elena the small book of poetry his mother once read to him, became their favorite room, filled now with new memories to layer over old grief, though the grief itself never entirely disappeared, simply softened into something bearable, something that no longer defined the whole of who Julian was. Margaret often told the story to new members of staff, of the night a storm blew a stranger into the Duke's chair, and how, by the very next morning, the household had begun to sense that something fundamental had shifted within their master, though none of them could have predicted just how completely that shift would transform not only the Duke himself, but the entire manor, and everyone fortunate enough to call it home. Elena, for her part, never forgot the fear and exhaustion that had first driven her, half frozen, into a stranger's chair on that terrible winter night. But she came to understand, in the years of warmth and partnership that followed, that sometimes the greatest mistakes carry within them the seeds of the greatest gifts, if only one has the courage to remain open to whatever unexpected transformation follows. And Julian, standing often now in his study before the very fire where he had first found her sleeping, understood a truth he had once believed lost to him forever, that a heart, however thoroughly broken, however carefully guarded behind years of grief and cold formality, could still find its way back to warmth, if only the right person happened to fall asleep, quite by mistake, in exactly the right chair.